research, which you're going to hear about, is all sorts of different things, but illness perception, psychological interventions, nursing care, socialization. She has done a mass of keynote presentations, grants in excess of £2 million from NIHR, MRC and other places, 6 PhD students completed, and chaired many trial committees, an enormous array of achievements. And Alison, we're really looking forward to hearing your inaugural lecture. The floor is yours.
I hope I can find it. Oh, that spoilt it. Oh, never mind. Well, I was going to start by saying it's a lovely, comfortable position to be in, sandwiched between Rachel, who is an old and dear friend, well, not so old, but a dear friend of many years, and Kevin, who is a wonderful colleague. And what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about my journey as I became a professor of health psychology. So I'll tell you a little bit about what health psychology is, and then I'm going to focus on two main areas of my work, which are chronic fatigue syndrome and diabetes, and then I'll tell you just a few other bits and pieces that I've done at the end. So when I was writing this talk, I actually found it quite difficult because, in common with many academics, my route from starting out to where I am now has been rather tortuous. And it's been a bit like going through a maze. And at times I felt it was a little bit like doing one of those puzzles where you start out with one word and then you have to get to another word by a series of small steps. And it was only after I'd written this slide that I realised that there were actually a different number of letters in those two words. And that maybe explains everything. Never mind. Ian's mentioned that I've recently been the chair of the Division of Health Psychology of the British Psychological Society, so I'm fairly confident that I can describe myself as a health psychologist. And I know that I'm a professor now because my poor dad, who passed away sadly just a couple of months ago after a long period with Alzheimer's disease, while he didn't always at the end know who I was, he didn't know if I was his mum, his sister, his wife, his daughter, his son. He had got the idea that I'd become a professor, and he used to say, "You're a top man." And he knew that was something that was good, so that was great. So health psychology. Health psychology has been defined as the application of psychological principles, theory and practice to all aspects of health and illness. It's a very broad discipline. And many health psychologists work predominantly in the field of trying to keep people healthy. They work in public health interventions like smoking and healthy diet and that sort of thing. My work has been more on the clinical side of health psychology, where I have been interested in how people experience illness and in helping people to manage illness better and improving their lives when they have chronic illnesses. And I was sort of trying to think of a unifying theme for my work. And like Rachel, I came up with some boxes and some ovals on the next slide. On this slide, the unifying theme is that I'm interested in the interrelations between what people think, their cognitions, how they feel, their emotions, and what they do when faced with a threat to their health. So it's beliefs, emotions, and behaviours. And of course, what's really interesting is that those behaviours and emotions in particular actually impact on physical health processes. But illness doesn't occur in a vacuum, and in parallel in my interest in patients' beliefs, emotions and behaviours, I've been interested in the role that friends, relatives, carers can play in the lives of people who have long-term conditions. So I've been interested also in what significant others feel about illnesses and what they can do about it, and how that impacts both on the patient and on themselves. So they're the two areas that I'm going to talk about. So this journey all started really back in 1993 when I answered an advert for a research assistant on a treatment trial of graded exercise in chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, as Ian mentioned, I'd had a previous career as a probation officer, and then I'd spent several years at home fruitlessly trying to separate my three boys. I gave up, decided to go back to work, and I actually I'd been out of academia for some time. I'd learnt how to switch a computer on, but I took a chance and applied for this job. And I was interviewed by Lewis Appleby, now Lewis Appleby CBE, and somehow or the other I managed to persuade him to take me on. And he later said that he recognised I didn't have as much experience as some of the applicants, but that I seemed to know how to speak to people. So that was good, and I'm really grateful that he did take me on. And while I was working on the project that I was employed on, I did a master's degree and started to publish some papers, and we saw the project through to fruition. I'm going to talk a bit now about chronic fatigue syndrome, so I thought it would be a good idea to tell you a little bit about it for those of you who don't know. This is a condition in which people experience for a long period of time very severe and disabling fatigue, not just normal tiredness, but fatigue which significantly impacts on their ability to do things in their life. So people often give up work, their social life is very disrupted, and there's a lot of work to show that there are heavy economic and social consequences of this condition. There are also other symptoms that are usually found in chronic fatigue syndrome, such as pain and sleep problems. Researchers have not been able to pinpoint one underlying cause for chronic fatigue syndrome, and most people think that the best way to understand it is that it's multifactorial in origin. But it can be triggered by different things. It differs from person to person. Quite often it's an infection. Now, the trial that I was employed to work on back in '93, which was published in '98, was a trial of two types of treatment, graded exercise and fluoxetine, which is an antidepressant drug. And patients who came into the trial were allocated to one of four arms at random. So they either received exercise and the antidepressant, or exercise and a placebo to the antidepressant, a placebo to exercise, which was an activity diary, and the antidepressant, or two placebos. The exercise was prescribed and supervised by a qualified physiotherapist, and the rationale for that approach was that at the time we knew that some people with chronic fatigue syndrome become less active over time, and that they lose fitness. And it was known that people in the population who are less active and less fit are more tired. And it seemed a good idea to see whether helping people to become more active would help their fatigue. And the fluoxetine was trialled because a significant proportion of people with chronic fatigue syndrome also suffer from depression. What we actually found at the end of that trial was that exercise did improve people's fitness, but it didn't have a very big effect on fatigue, a marginal effect. The fluoxetine helped people's depressive symptoms, but it didn't help their fatigue. But perhaps the most interesting, or one of the more interesting aspects of the trial, was that for patients randomised to exercise, if they could tolerate it, they did well on it, but a very large proportion of the patients, 37%, actually dropped out of treatment. So we learnt from that trial, and we've learned from other work that's been done since, that an essential feature of any therapy for chronic fatigue syndrome which involves exercise is that it's started at a sufficiently low level and it's ramped up sufficiently gradually. And I'll explain why in a minute. Now, after that treatment trial, I went on to do my PhD in diabetes, but I'm going to talk about that in the second section of this talk. So I'm going to skip ahead a bit and just carry on talking for a little bit longer about chronic fatigue syndrome. And in 1999, I applied for a job as a lecturer in psychology, which I actually started on the first day of the new millennium. And on the interview panel, there was Richard Bentall, who had recently completed a trial of a treatment for chronic fatigue syndrome, which was published the following year. And I remember that he asked me two questions. The first question was, I've just heard about an upcoming funding stream from the Medical Research Council for the management of chronic fatigue syndrome, research into the management of chronic fatigue syndrome. How would you feel about leading an application to that funding stream? So with it being a job interview, I didn't say, oh no, that sounds like far too much work. I said, oh yeah, great, yeah, let's do it. So we did it, and to cut a long story short, in 2003 we were awarded the money, and then we ran a trial of pragmatic rehabilitation of chronic fatigue syndrome from 2004 to 2009. And this treatment, pragmatic rehabilitation, is based on a model of chronic fatigue syndrome which sees it as being due to physiological dysregulation. And it's a feature of pragmatic rehabilitation is that this model, the physiological dysregulation model, is explicitly presented to patients at the start of the treatment in an initial session. And it's supported by a reference manual. And the model provides the rationale for a gradual increase in activity to try to restore functioning and to reverse the deconditioning. And it's very important that that increase in activity is done gradually, and it's designed collaboratively with the patient. So I'm going to represent this model on two sort of diagrams here. So here we have a patient who has an initial illness or some other trigger, and who, for some reason, it can be a variety of reasons, suffers a delayed recovery or a slower than expected recovery. And normally what happens if you carry on feeling ill is that you rest. And what we've found recently that patients with chronic fatigue syndrome quite often tend to want to struggle on even though they're feeling ill. So they'll carry on and do activity until they crash. And you can see on this graph I've depicted the sort of activity level. So there's a lot of activity, then a crash, then resume activity, crash. But as you can see, the activity level gradually drops off. And what the result of that is that patients become generally deconditioned, and this physiological dysregulation that I was talking about takes place. So there's evidence for deconditioning in the cardiovascular and muscular systems, for sleep disturbance, and for HPA axis dysregulation, which sounds long and complicated. I haven't got time to go into it. And in this deconditioned state, when patients attempt to resume activity because they've got to go to work or whatever, they experience symptoms. And some of those symptoms may be things like muscle soreness that can sometimes come on quite a while after exertion and be very disconcerting for patients, can make them feel fearful and demoralised, and tends to make them think, I'd better rest again, so they get into a vicious cycle. Now, this model has been supported by work by many eminent researchers in the field, and amongst them two of my very good friends, Rona Moss-Morris and Trudy Chalder. Unfortunately, Rona's not able to be here today, but I'm really honoured that Trudy's come up from London to be here. And you've already seen it, but this is a picture of the three of us on holiday with some bloke that we met. And it didn't contribute anything to the development of the model. So I think it's pretty obvious from what I've said that the model suggests that in order to treat CFS, what you need to do is to gradually increase people's activity levels. And the key here is to start at a level that is easily manageable and build it up very gradually. And if you do that, there's less chance that symptoms will be experienced at a high level. So patients can get used to the idea that a little bit of activity doesn't cause relapse, and they can gradually build up and spiral themselves out of the vicious spiral into a virtuous spiral. So, the trial that we did based on pragmatic rehabilitation, the FINE trial, started in 2004, finished in 2009, and we compared pragmatic rehabilitation to GP treatment as usual and a counselling intervention. There were 296 patients in the trial, treated for 18 weeks, at home by specially trained general nurses. And we found, in short, that pragmatic rehabilitation did improve fatigue, particularly at the end of treatment. There was a drop-off in the effect over a one-year follow-up period, but it did improve fatigue. And in subsequent analyses that we've done that I'm currently writing up, we found that when patients' fatigue improved, they said that they were limiting their activities less, and they also believed that they no longer believed that activity was harmful. So these behavioural and belief indicators tend to support the model. Okay, I'm going to leave chronic fatigue syndrome there and move on to the second part and go back to my PhD, which I started in 1997. And in 1997, I was offered the opportunity to do this PhD by Nick Tarrier, who was at the time the head of the Department of Clinical Psychology in Manchester. And it was a fully funded PhD, and I absolutely jumped at the opportunity, not only because it